Winter, 1875. On a lonely ranch, deep in the Wyoming Territory, a blizzard was tearing Clara Hayes's cabin apart. "Clara, wake up. You're freezing." Silas Thorne dropped to his knees, his rugged face pale with fear. Clara trembled beneath the blankets, her lips turning blue, her eyes wide with old terror. "Don't touch me," she whispered. Silas froze, holding back every instinct to reach for her. "I'm not asking for anything," he said, his voice rough but gentle. "Just sleep beside me tonight. I'll be careful." But outside that storm, the husband Clara thought was dead was about to return, with a secret that could destroy them both. Stay with this story, and don't forget to subscribe, because Clara's fight for freedom is only beginning. The train came in low and slow, smoke dragging behind it like something wounded. Clara Hayes watched the platform through the frosted window before the wheels even stopped grinding. White, all of it white. Snow stacked against the station house. Snow piled along the fence rails. Snow reaching out toward hills that didn't end. She stepped down onto the platform, and the wind hit her first. It went straight through her coat, the thin wool one she'd worn on the docks back home, and she understood, right away, that nothing about her had prepared her for this place. No one called her name. No one waved. She stood there with her single trunk and let the cold settle into her bones while the train pulled away behind her, the sound of it fading into the white until there was nothing left but wind. A man in a heavy coat finally walked toward her from the station house. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. "You'd be Mrs. Vance," he said. It wasn't a question. "Clara," she said. "Clara Hayes. Silas Thorne. I run the ranch for Arthur." He paused, and something in his face changed, some weight settling behind his eyes. "There's no easy way to say this. Arthur's dead. Barn fire. 3 weeks back. We buried what was left of him." The wind kept blowing. Clara heard the words, understood them, but they didn't land anywhere yet. She had crossed half a country to marry a man she'd never met, and now he was ash under 6 feet of frozen ground. "I don't understand," she said. "I have a letter from him. He was expecting me. I know it." Silas rubbed a gloved hand over his jaw. "But he's gone, and what he left behind is debt. A lot of it, owed to the marshal in town." Clara's stomach dropped. She'd left everything behind for this. A ticket, a promise, a chance to start clean. And now she was standing on a frozen platform with a dead husband and a debt that wasn't hers. "What happens to me?" Silas didn't answer right away. He looked at her the way a man sizes up a storm before deciding whether to ride through it or wait it out. "You can stay in town," he said finally. "Marshal Gentry will find work for you. I wouldn't recommend it. Or you can come to the ranch. Work off what Arthur owed. It's hard labor, cold mornings, sore hands, no comfort in it. But it's honest." Clara looked past him, out at the endless white stretching toward the mountains, and thought about what waited for her in town if she said no. She thought about the marshal Silas mentioned, the way his name came out flat and careful, like a man choosing his words around a rattlesnake. "I'll come to the ranch," she said. Silas nodded once, like he'd expected that answer and respected her for it anyway. He picked up her trunk before she could argue and carried it to the wagon without another word. The ride out was long and silent. Clara pulled her coat tighter and watched the land roll past. Fences buried under drifts, cattle standing hunched against the wind. She had read about the West in newspapers back home, stories of open sky and freedom. Nobody wrote about the cold that got into your teeth, or the silence that pressed down so hard it felt like another kind of weather. The ranch house came into view as the sun dropped low, a squat shape against the white, with smoke curling from its chimney. Silas showed her to a small room off the back, sparse but clean, a narrow bed and a stove that needed lighting. "Wood's out back," he said. "You'll want to learn to split it yourself. Nobody here has time to do for you what you can do for yourself." It wasn't cruelty in his voice. Clara understood that much even then. It was practicality, the kind that kept people alive out here. She went out that first evening and picked up the axe leaning against the woodpile. It was heavier than it looked. Her first swing missed the log entirely and jarred her wrist so hard she nearly dropped it. The second swing split a piece clean, but tore the skin open across her palm. She didn't cry. She'd learned a long time ago that crying didn't fix anything, didn't put food on a table or keep a roof standing. She wrapped her hand in a strip of cloth torn from her petticoat and kept swinging until the woodpile by the door was taller than it had been. Silas watched from the porch a while, arms crossed, saying nothing. When she finally came inside, hands raw and shaking, he set a cup of something hot in front of her without comment. First day's always the worst, he said. Gets easier. Clara wrapped her hands around the cup and let the warmth bite into her blistered skin. Outside, the wind kept howling against the walls. The same wind that had followed her off the train. The same wind that would follow her through every hard morning that came after. She had crossed a country for a husband who was gone before she arrived. And what she'd found instead was work, debt, and a stranger who didn't ask for her gratitude. It wasn't the life she'd been promised, but she was alive. And out here, she was starting to understand. That counted for something. The days at the ranch fell into a rhythm Clara hadn't expected to find so quickly. She woke before the sun most mornings, the cold seeping through the walls, no matter how much wood she fed the stove the night before. She learned to dress fast, layers over layers, because standing still in that room too long invited the cold to settle into her joints. Breakfast was her first real test. She'd never cooked over an open flame before. Never had to guess at timing, without a clock ticking on some factory wall to tell her when a shift started and ended. The first batch of biscuits she made came out black on the bottom and raw in the middle. She threw them to the chickens before anyone could see, then tried again and again until Abigail showed up on the third morning and took the whole operation out of her hands without so much as an introduction. "You're using too much lard," Abigail said, not unkindly, sizing up the mess on the counter. "Out here, waste catches up with you. Everything you use, you'll need again." Clara watched her hands move, quick and sure, folding the dough with a rhythm that came from decades of practice rather than any book. Abigail was older, maybe 60, with silver hair pulled back tight and hands roughened by a lifetime of exactly this kind of work. She didn't ask permission to take over the kitchen. She just did it, the same way she seemed to do everything, without apology. "Silas sent you," Clara said. Silas didn't send anybody. "I came because a woman alone on a ranch in winter needs more than one set of hands showing her how things work." Abigail glanced at Clara's palms, still wrapped from the wood splitting. "Let me see those." Clara hesitated, then held them out. Abigail turned them over, examined the raw skin, the blisters that had broken and scabbed and broken again. "You've been favoring the axe wrong," Abigail said. "Grip's too tight. You're fighting the wood instead of letting the weight do the work." She reached into a bag at her hip and pulled out a small jar, something pale and waxy inside. "Willow bark and sage. Rub it in before bed. It'll pull the sting out and keep the skin from splitting worse." "Where did you learn that?" "From the Shoshone women who lived on this land before any of us. Where else would you learn something that actually works?" Abigail said it plainly, no reverence in her voice, just fact. "White folks came out here thinking they knew better than the land. Most of them died finding out they didn't. The ones who survived learned to listen." Clara turned the jar over in her hands. It felt like something more than medicine. It felt like an admission that survival here wasn't about grit alone, that it required humility too, a willingness to learn from people the world back east had taught her to overlook entirely. The wood splitting continued each afternoon, and Silas started showing up to correct her form without making a production of it. He never grabbed her hands to guide them the way she half expected, half feared, remembering other men who'd used the excuse of teaching to take liberties. Instead, he stood a few feet off and talked her through it. "Let the axe head do the work," he said one afternoon, watching her swing miss for the third time in a row. "You're trying to muscle it. Won't work. Won't last a winter if you keep swinging like that." I'm not exactly built like a lumberjack, Clara said, breathing hard, sweat cooling fast against her skin despite the cold. Nobody's built for it at first. You get built for it by doing it. He nodded toward the log. Try again. Aim for the same spot as last time. Not a new one. She tried again, and the axe bit clean through, splitting the log in two clean halves. Something in her chest eased at the sight of it. A small victory in a week that had handed her nothing but failures. There it is, Silas said, and something close to approval crossed his face before he turned back toward the barn. It was during one of these afternoons. Cleaning out a storage trunk Silas had asked her to sort through. Old ranch records and Arthur's belongings mixed together in careless piles. That Clara found the watch. It was silver, heavier than she expected. With an engraving on the back, she had to angle toward the window light to read clearly. AV, it said, and beneath the initials, a small inscription, to the man who always finds his way back. She carried it out to the barn, where Silas was mending a bridle, working leather between his rough fingers, with the kind of patience that seemed to define everything he did. I found this, she said, holding it out. It was in the trunk with Arthur's things. Silas took it, turned it over once, and his expression shifted into something Clara hadn't seen from him yet. Confusion, maybe, or the beginning of it. This can't be right, he said. What do you mean? I mean, I put this watch in the ground with him myself. Wrapped it in his hand before we closed the coffin. He looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Clara saw something uncertain behind his eyes. There's no reason for it to be sitting in a trunk in this house. Maybe there were two watches, Clara offered, though even as she said it, the words felt thin. Maybe, Silas said, but he didn't sound convinced, and neither did she. He set the watch down on the workbench like it had suddenly gotten heavier than silver should be, and neither of them touched it again that day. That night, lying awake in her narrow bed, Clara turned the mystery over in her mind. She'd come to this territory believing her husband was already dead, and there had been a strange kind of relief in that. A clean break from a marriage she'd entered out of desperation rather than affection. But the watch sat in the barn now like a question mark, and questions in a place this remote had a way of turning dangerous. She pushed the thought aside, telling herself it was nothing, a coincidence, a duplicate item Arthur had owned before his death. But sleep didn't come easy, and when it did, it came shallow, the kind that left her tired. Come morning anyway. The following days brought more lessons. More small failures turned slowly into small successes. Silas taught her how to read the weather in the color of the sky at dusk, how to recognize the particular stillness that came before a storm rolled down out of the mountains. He taught her which plants along the creek bed were safe to eat and which would make a person sick or worse. Information passed down from Abigail originally, he admitted. Credit given honestly, rather than claimed as his own. Survival out here doesn't come from miracles, he told her one evening. The two of them standing at the fence line, watching the sun drop behind the hills, in streaks of orange and violet. It comes from respecting the earth and the people who understand it. Anybody who thinks they can conquer this land on stubbornness alone ends up in a shallow grave come spring thaw. Clara thought about the city she'd left behind, the factories and tenements where survival meant something entirely different. A battle against machinery and landlords, and men who saw women as replaceable parts in a larger system. Out here, the battle was against weather and distance and isolation, but at least it felt honest. The land didn't pretend to care about her. It simply was what it was, and either she learned to live within its rules, or she didn't survive to see spring. She caught herself watching Silas more than she meant to, not with any romantic notion, not yet, but with a kind of curiosity she hadn't allowed herself in a long time. He carried himself careful, deliberate, like a man who'd learned the hard way that carelessness cost lives. She noticed the burn scar on his forearm one afternoon, when he rolled his sleeves up to wash at the pump, a jagged mark that ran from wrist to elbow, old and pale against his skin. She didn't ask about it. Some things, she was learning, people shared when they were ready, and not a moment before. She understood that better than most, given the scars she carried on her own wrists. Faded now, but never quite gone. Remnants of a desperation she'd rather forget than explain. Abigail noticed them once, changing the dressing on Clara's blistered hands, and her eyes lingered a moment too long on the thin white lines crossing Clara's wrists before she said anything. "You don't have to tell me," Abigail said, "but if you ever want to. I've heard worse. I've lived worse. This land is full of women running from something. Doesn't make you weak for surviving it." Clara felt something crack open in her chest. Not pain exactly, but the release of a pressure she hadn't realized she'd been carrying since she stepped off that train. She didn't tell Abigail the whole story that day, but she told her enough. Enough to feel, for the first time in years, that someone out here might understand rather than judge. The wood pile grew steadier by the week. Her hands toughened despite the cracks and blisters, and the ranch that had felt so foreign in her first days began, slowly, to feel less like a prison sentence and more like something she was building for herself. One split log and one burned biscuit at a time. But the watch stayed in her mind, tucked away like a splinter under skin, small enough to ignore most days, sharp enough to remind her it was there whenever she let her guard down. Marshal Elias Gentry arrived on a gray morning in late January, riding in slow and easy on a black horse that looked better fed than most of the cattle on the ranch. Clara heard the sound of hooves on frozen ground before she saw him, and something in her stomach tightened before she even reached the window. Silas was out checking the fence line, and by the time he made it back to the house, Gentry had already dismounted and was standing on the porch, hat in hand, waiting with the patience of a man who had never once in his life doubted he'd get what he came for. "Mrs. Vance," he said when Clara opened the door, his voice smooth, almost pleasant. "I do hope I'm not intruding." He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped past her into the front room and settled himself at the kitchen table like he'd done it 100 times before, like the space belonged to him more than it belonged to her. Clara had expected a brute. Newspapers back east loved to run stories about lawless frontier towns and the rough men who policed them, fists first and questions never. Gentry wasn't that. He was clean-shaven, his coat pressed despite the miles he must have ridden, his boots polished even with mud clinging to the yard outside. He removed a silver coin from his vest pocket and began tapping it against the table. An idle habit, or maybe not so idle at all. Tap, tap, tap. "Arthur's debts have come due," Gentry said, still smiling, still pleasant, as if he were discussing the weather rather than a woman's entire future. $600. Give or take interest. A considerable sum for a widow, with no income and no family out here to speak of. "I'm working the debt off at the ranch," Clara said. Silas arranged it. Silas Thorne arranged a great many things in his life, not all of them legal. Gentry's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "I'm afraid ranch labor doesn't quite cover a debt this size, Mrs. Vance. Not at the rate you'd earn splitting firewood." Tap, tap, tap. Clara felt the sound settle into her chest like a slow drip of ice water, each strike of coin against wood pulling her further into a kind of dread she recognized from years back east. The specific fear of powerful men who didn't need to raise their voices to make a threat land. "What would you suggest instead?" she asked, though some part of her already knew, already felt the shape of the answer coming before he said it. "I have a proposal," Gentry said, leaning back in his chair, entirely at ease. "I could see my way to forgiving the entire debt, wiping the slate clean, if you were willing to become my companion. A woman of your bearing shouldn't have to spend her days chopping wood and burning her hands raw. I could offer you a proper house in town, comfort, security." The word companion hung in the air, dressed up nice but meaning something far uglier underneath. Clara had heard men use pretty words to disguise ugly intentions before, and she understood exactly what he was offering and exactly what he expected in return. "I'll pay the debt through my labor," she said, keeping her voice steady, though her hands had curled into fists in her lap. as agreed. Gentry's smile finally faltered. Just slightly. Just enough to reveal something colder underneath. That's an unwise position, Mrs. Vance. Debs like this have a way of growing teeth when they go unpaid long enough. The door opened behind them. Cold air rushing in along with the sound of boots on the floorboards. Silas stood in the doorway, snow still melting off his shoulders, his expression unreadable, but his eyes fixed hard on Gentry. "Marshall," Silas said, the word coming out flat. "Mr. Thorne, I was just discussing debt arrangements with Mrs. Vance. I heard the tail end of it from the porch." Silas crossed the room and stood behind Clara's chair, not touching her, but close enough that his presence filled the space between her and Gentry, like a wall going up. "The debt's being worked off through ranch labor, same as we discussed when you first came to collect. Nothing's changed. $600 is a substantial sum for a ranch foreman to guarantee," Gentry said, tapping the coin once more. Slower now, deliberate. "I wonder if you're overstepping your authority here." "I'm not overstepping anything. I'm stating fact." Silas's voice stayed level, but there was steel underneath it now. The kind that made even Gentry's easy composure flicker. A human body is never collateral. Not for a debt. Not for anything. You want the money? You'll get it through labor and time. Same as any other creditor waiting on a payment plan. You want something else. You'll find the law doesn't back you nearly as far as you think it does. Gentry studied him for a long moment, the silver coin finally going still between his fingers. Something calculating passed behind his eyes. A man recalculating odds rather than backing down entirely. Federal land grant regulations do offer certain protections to widows working inherited property, Gentry said slowly, as if reciting something he'd rather not admit. "I suppose I could extend the arrangement. 90 days. After that, the full debt comes due, one way or another." 90 days, Silas agreed. Gentry stood, straightened his coat, and offered Clara a small bow that felt more mocking than courteous. "A pleasure, Mrs. Vance. I do hope you'll reconsider my offer before the 90 days run out." Comfort has a way of looking more appealing once winter really sets its teeth in. He left without another word, his horse's hooves fading into the distance until the ranch fell quiet again. Quiet, except for the sound of Clara's own heartbeat, still hammering hard against her ribs. "You all right?" Silas asked once the door had closed. Clara nodded, though her hands were still shaking. "I've dealt with men like him before. Men who think politeness excuses everything underneath it. He's dangerous, precisely because he doesn't look it," Silas said, moving to the window to watch Gentry's horse disappear down the frozen road. "Men who yell, you can see coming. Men who smile while they threaten you. Those are the ones you have to watch closest." "Why did you say that?" "About a body never being collateral." Silas turned back to face her, and for a moment something vulnerable crossed his features before he tucked it away again. "Because it's true. Because too many folks out here treat women like property to be traded off when convenient. Debts settled with flesh instead of coin. I've seen it happen. I won't stand by and watch it happen again." Clara studied him, trying to read the history behind his words, the specific weight in his voice that suggested this wasn't some abstract principle, but something he'd witnessed up close, something that had cost him. "Thank you," she said simply. "Don't thank me yet," Silas said. 90 days isn't long. And a man like Gentry doesn't offer extensions out of generosity. He's buying time to find another angle. That night, Clara lay awake listening to the wind, turning the marshal's visit over in her mind. She'd survived men like him before, men who dressed cruelty up in silk and called it kindness. But something about the tapping of that coin against the table stayed with her, a rhythm that echoed in her ears long after the sound itself had stopped, a reminder that some threats didn't need to shout to be heard clearly. She thought about Silas standing behind her chair, not touching her, but present in a way that made the whole room feel steadier. She thought about the phrase he'd used, "A human body is never collateral," and how rare it was to hear a man say something like that and mean it all the way through. 90 days. She didn't know yet what shape the coming fight would take, but she understood. lying there in the dark, that she would need to be ready for it, and that readiness would require more than good intentions. It would require the kind of strength she hadn't yet built, the kind that came from practice and patience and a willingness to learn skills she'd spent her whole life avoiding. Come morning, she decided, she would ask Silas to teach her to shoot. Silas didn't argue when she brought it up. He simply nodded, like he'd been expecting the request, maybe even hoping for it, and led her out to the flat stretch of land behind the barn, where a row of tin cans sat lined up on a fence post from some earlier practice session. The rifle he handed her felt heavier than she expected, cold enough that the metal stung through her gloves. She held it awkward at first, unsure where her hands belonged, and Silas adjusted her grip with careful, economical movements, never lingering longer than necessary. Stock goes here, against your shoulder, he said, tapping the spot. Not your arm, your shoulder. It'll kick, and if you don't brace it right, you'll bruise something fierce. How bad is the kick? Bad enough the first time to surprise you. You'll get used to it. Clara raised the rifle, sighted down the barrel toward the cans, and felt her pulse pick up, a low hum of nerves running through her chest. The smell of gun oil hung sharp in the cold air, mixing with the smell of frost and pine from the tree line beyond the fence. Take your time, Silas said, standing a few feet back, giving her room. Breathe out slow. Squeeze the trigger. Don't yank it. She breathed out, the air fogging in front of her, and squeezed. The blast came louder than she'd braced for, a sharp crack that tore through the quiet morning and sent a violent jolt through her shoulder. The recoil knocked her back a step, and before she could steady herself, something inside her chest seized up hard, memory crashing over the present moment like a wave she couldn't outrun. The rifle clattered to the ground. She was back there, suddenly, in a room she'd spent years trying to forget. The sound of a slammed door, the sharp crack of something breaking against a wall, the specific terror of a body bigger than hers, closing the distance between them with violence in every step. Her breath came fast and shallow, her hands trembling, her vision narrowing until the white fields around her blurred into something unrecognizable. She heard Silas's voice from a distance, calm, steady, cutting through the panic like a rope thrown into deep water. Clara, Clara, look at me. She couldn't. Her knees buckled, and she found herself on the frozen ground, arms wrapped around her own chest, gasping for air that wouldn't quite fill her lungs. Silas didn't rush toward her. He didn't grab her shoulders or pull her against him the way some men might have, mistaking closeness for comfort. Instead, he knelt down at the rifle first, working the bolt with slow, deliberate movements, unloading the remaining rounds one by one. Each metallic click rang out clear in the cold air, a sound meant to be heard, meant to prove the weapon was empty and harmless. Then he set it aside, well out of reach, and lowered himself to the ground, a few feet from her, sitting in the frozen mud without complaint, meeting her at eye level rather than looming over her. You're safe, he said, voice low and even. Nobody's going to hurt you. Not here. Not by me. Clara's breath kept coming ragged, her whole body shaking now, not just from cold, but from the force of memories she'd spent years trying to bury. She pressed her palms against her eyes, humiliated by her own reaction, furious at herself for falling apart over a sound. I'm sorry, she managed. I don't know why I don't apologize, Silas said. Your body remembers things your mind would rather forget. That's not weakness. That's just how surviving something ugly works sometimes. How do you know that? He was quiet a moment, watching the tree line rather than her face, giving her privacy, even in the middle of a conversation. Because I've seen it in men who rode with me years back. Men who'd lived through things that never really left them, no matter how far they ran. Loud sounds, sudden movements, certain smells. It doesn't always make sense from the outside. Doesn't need to. It's real all the same. Clara lowered her hands slowly, her breathing beginning to even out, the panic loosening its grip inch by inch. She studied Silas sitting there in the mud beside her, patient, unhurried, making no move to close the distance between them, even though every instinct in her expected him to. "You're not going to touch me," she said, half question, half statement. "Not unless you ask me to. And even then, I'd think twice." He finally looked at her, something steady and sure in his gaze. A person doesn't earn trust by demanding it. They earn it by proving, over and over, that they won't take what isn't offered. Something in Clara's chest loosened at those words. A tightness she hadn't realized she'd been carrying for years, built up layer by layer from every man who'd ever mistaken her body as something owed to him rather than something she alone had claim over. They sat there a long while, the cold seeping up through the ground, neither of them in any hurry to move. Clara found herself studying the burn scar on his forearm again, visible where his sleeve had ridden up during the struggle with the rifle. "Can I ask about that?" she said, nodding toward the scar. "You don't have to answer." Silas glanced down at his own arm, and for a moment something distant crossed his face, an old weight resurfacing. "Someday, not today. Today's about you learning something you need to know, not about digging up things I'd rather leave buried." "Fair enough. You want to try again?" he asked, nodding toward the rifle lying a few feet away in the snow. "No shame in stopping for the day if you're not ready." Clara looked at the weapon, then out toward the tin cans still lined up on the fence post. Patient and unbothered by the storm that had just passed through her, she thought about Gentry's silver coin tapping against the table, about the 90 days ticking down toward some confrontation she couldn't yet see the shape of, about the fact that fear, left unchallenged, only grew larger the longer it went unanswered. "I want to try again," she said. Silas nodded, picked up the rifle, and reloaded it slow enough that she could watch every step, every round sliding into place. He handed it back to her, this time staying close enough to catch her if the recoil knocked her off balance, but not so close that it felt like a cage. She raised the rifle again. Her hands still trembled, but less this time. "Breathe out slow," Silas said. "Squeeze, don't yank." She fired. The recoil hit her shoulder again, sharp and jarring, but this time she rode it out, planting her feet the way he'd shown her, absorbing the shock instead of letting it knock her backward. The can on the fence post spun off into the snow, and for a moment, standing there with the smell of gunpowder sharp in the air, Clara felt something unfamiliar settle into her chest, something that felt almost like power. "There it is," Silas said. The same words he'd used the day she finally split a log clean. Clara lowered the rifle, breathing hard but steady now, and looked out at the fence line where 3 cans still stood waiting. 90 days wasn't long, but for the first time since Gentry's visit, she felt something other than dread when she thought about the fight ahead. She felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, capable of standing her ground rather than simply enduring whatever came for her. The lesson continued through the afternoon, can after can falling into the snow, her aim growing steadier with each attempt. By the time the sun dropped low behind the mountains, her shoulder ached and her ears rang faintly, but something inside her had shifted permanently, a quiet certainty settling into place that hadn't been there before. She was learning, one skill at a time, that survival out here wasn't only about enduring the land. It was about becoming someone capable of protecting what mattered, someone who no longer had to wait for rescue because she'd built the strength to stand and fight for herself. The storm came down out of the mountains on the 3rd week of February, and Clara knew before Silas said a word that this one was different from the snows that had come before it. The sky turned a color she'd never seen, a bruised gray that swallowed the sun whole by early afternoon, and the wind picked up with a howl that rattled the shutters loose from their hinges. "Get everything you can inside," Silas said, already moving toward the barn. "Water, wood, whatever feed the animals need for a few days. This one's going to sit on us hard." Clara worked fast, hauling buckets from the well before the pump could freeze solid, stacking wood inside the door until her arms ached and her lungs burned from the cold air. By the time Silas made it back from securing the barn, the first real gusts had already started, snow driving sideways so thick it swallowed the fence line only 20 feet from the porch. They barricaded themselves inside as the light died completely, and the storm settled into a rhythm that felt less like weather and more like something alive, testing the walls, searching for weakness. It found one sometime past midnight. The crack came sudden and violent, a groan of timber giving way under the weight of snow that had been piling on the roof for hours. Clara was up before she fully understood what had happened, and Silas was already moving, shouting for her to get back as a section of the roof near the far corner caved inward, snow and cold air pouring through the gap. "Get the blankets. Everything you've got." Silas called over the roar of wind now screaming through the opening. "We can't fix this tonight. We have to seal off this room and hunker down in the back." They worked together in the chaos, dragging furniture, blankets, whatever could block the gap enough to slow the bleeding heat. By the time they'd retreated to the small back room where Clara usually slept, the fire in the main room had already begun to die. Starved of the warmth it needed to survive, against a storm intent on stealing every degree of heat the cabin had left. The night stretched on, and the cold deepened. Clara wrapped herself in every blanket she owned, but it wasn't enough. Her body started to shake somewhere around the deepest hour of the night. A tremor she couldn't control, no matter how tightly she curled herself against the wall. Silas noticed before she said anything. Clara, his voice came sharp, in a way she hadn't heard from him before. He crossed the small room and knelt beside her, pressing the back of his hand against her cheek, then her neck. "You're too cold. This isn't just the room being cold. This is your body losing the fight." "I'm fine," she managed, though her teeth chattered hard enough to swallow the words. "You're not fine. You're heading toward hypothermia. And if we don't fix it now, you won't wake up come morning." He said it plain, no dramatics. Just fact laid bare the way he laid every hard truth bare. "I need to get you warm, real warm, faster than blankets alone can manage." Clara understood what he meant before he said it outright, and something in her chest clenched tight with old fear. The kind that had nothing to do with the cold, and everything to do with years of learning that closeness from a man rarely came without a price attached. Silas seemed to read the fear crossing her face, because he sat back slightly, giving her space even in a room this small. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I'm telling you what your body needs to survive the night. Shared warmth. That's all it is. I'll keep my distance if that's what you need. But I need you to understand the risk if we don't do this." Clara looked at him, really looked, searching his face for the calculation she'd learned to expect from men who wanted something and dressed the wanting up as concern. She found none of it. Just worry, plain and honest. And, beneath it, a restraint so deliberate, it felt like its own kind of promise. "Okay," she said, the word coming out small. Silas stripped off his heavy duster, the one still damp from the storm outside, and laid it aside. He lay down on the floor, near what remained of the dying embers, keeping a full foot of distance between them, close enough to share warmth, but far enough that Clara could feel the space he'd left her, deliberate and respectful. "Sleep beside me," he said, his voice rough now, worn down by cold and exhaustion and something else underneath. Something careful. "Just tonight. I'll be gentle." The words settled over her like something warmer than the blankets. Not a demand, not even quite a request. More like a promise offered before she'd even had the chance to ask for one. Clara closed the gap slowly, inch by inch, giving herself time to test whether her body would tense the way it usually did around closeness like this. It didn't. Silas stayed still, his breathing even, his hands tucked carefully against his own chest, rather than reaching for her. And somewhere in that stillness, Clara found she trusted him enough to close the last of the distance. She settled against him, and the warmth radiating off his body hit her like something physical. A relief so total it nearly brought tears to her eyes. He didn't move, didn't shift closer than she'd already come. Simply let his body serve as a shield against the storm, still raging outside the walls. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me. Just sleep. Storm will be gone by morning." Clara lay there, listening to the wind howl against the cabin, feeling the steady rise and fall of Silas's breathing beside her, and something inside her that had been clenched tight for years. Maybe her whole life began to loosen. It wasn't romance, not in that moment. It was something quieter, and in its own way larger. It was the simple, radical experience of lying beside a man and feeling safe rather than afraid. Somewhere in the deepest hour of the night, half asleep, half awake, she reached for his hand. Silas went still for a moment, as if surprised, then closed his fingers gently around hers. Nothing more, nothing demanded. Just the quiet acknowledgement of two people who had survived something together and come out the other side of it, still whole. She slept, finally, warmth spreading through her limbs, the shaking easing until it stopped altogether. And in that sleep, for the first time since stepping off the train into a world of ice and grief, Clara dreamed of nothing at all, just darkness, peaceful and undisturbed. The storm broke sometime before dawn, the wind dying down to a low moan before falling silent altogether. Clara woke to gray light filtering through the gap in the roof. Snow drifted in a fine layer across the floorboards near the doorway, and Silas, already up, feeding the last of the wood into the stove to coax some warmth back into the room. "Roof needs fixing before the next storm rolls through," he said when he noticed her stirring. "I'll ride out for supplies once the road's clear enough." Clara sat up, her body stiff from the cold and the floor, but alive in a way that felt different from the day before. Steadier, somehow, like something inside her had recalibrated overnight. They spent the morning digging out from the storm, clearing snow from the porch, checking on the animals in the barn who'd weathered the night better than the cabin had. The world outside looked scrubbed clean, sunlight glinting hard off drifts taller than the fence posts, silent except for the occasional crack of snow shifting off a branch somewhere in the distance. It was near midday when Clara heard horses approaching, and something in the rhythm of the hoofbeats set her nerves on edge before she even saw the riders crest the hill. Silas noticed, too, straightening from the woodpile, his hand drifting toward the rifle, propped against the barn door. Two men rode into view. Marshal Gentry, unmistakable even at a distance in his pressed coat and polished boots. And beside him, a second rider. Clara didn't recognize at first. Not until they drew close enough for her to see his face clearly. Her breath caught somewhere deep in her chest. Arthur Vance sat atop the second horse, alive, thinner than the photograph she'd been sent before the wedding, but unmistakably him. The husband, she'd been told, died in a barn fire 3 weeks before her arrival, the man whose grave she'd stood beside in the snow. Mourning a stranger she'd never had the chance to meet. "That's not possible," she said, the words barely audible even to herself. Silas had gone rigid beside her, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on Arthur with an expression that mixed disbelief with something darker, something like fury barely leashed. The two riders stopped a short distance from the porch, and Arthur dismounted first, moving with an easy confidence that suggested he'd expected exactly this reaction and had rehearsed his response to it. "Clara," he said, tipping his hat like this, was any ordinary greeting. "I imagine you have questions. You're supposed to be dead." Her voice came out steadier than she felt, anger rising up underneath the shock, burning away the cold that had settled into her bones the moment she recognized his face. "A regrettable misunderstanding," Arthur said, though nothing about his tone suggested regret. "The fire was real enough. The body inside it wasn't mine. A convenient arrangement, given the debts I owed certain parties around here. Easier to disappear than to keep running from men looking to collect." "You let me believe I was a widow," Clara said. "You let this whole territory believe you were dead. And in doing so, I bought myself time to settle my affairs properly." Arthur glanced toward Gentry, some unspoken understanding passing between them. "Which brings us to the matter at hand. This ranch belongs to me, legally, given I'm demonstrably alive. And you, Clara, as my legal wife, belong to me as well, though I have other arrangements in mind for you, given how inconvenient a wife has become to my plans." The words hit like a physical blow, and Clara felt the old fear rise up fast, the instinct to shrink. to make herself smaller in the face of a threat she'd spent years learning to survive by disappearing rather than confronting. But something else rose up alongside it now, something new, forged over weeks of splitting wood and firing rifles, and standing her ground against Marshal Gentry's polite cruelty. She didn't shrink. Instead, she moved toward the cabin door, grabbed the hunting knife she'd left on the counter after skinning rabbits the day before, and planted herself firmly in front of the hearth, blade held steady in her hand. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said. "Not now, not ever." Arthur's expression flickered with surprise, quickly masked behind a thin smile. "Feisty. I suppose the frontier air agrees with you. There are mining camps out past the Western Territories, always looking for women willing to earn their keep," Gentry said from his horse, his voice carrying the same pleasant, terrible calm it always did. "I imagine you'd fetch a fair price, Mrs. Vance, given the circumstances." Silas stepped forward then, placing himself between Clara and the two riders, his own hand steady on the rifle he'd retrieved from the barn. "You're trespassing on land I've legally worked for the past 3 years," Silas said. "Land grant papers filed in Arthur's name. Papers that specify improvement and occupation requirements that Arthur hasn't met. Given he's been busy faking his own death rather than tending his claim. Technicalities," Arthur said, waving a hand dismissively. "Ones I intend to sort out through proper legal channels. In the meantime, I suggest you hand over my wife and step aside from a fight that isn't yours." "She's not property to be handed over," Silas said, his voice hard now. "All patience gone. She's a person. And she's already told you her answer." Arthur's gaze flicked between Silas and Clara, something calculating settling behind his eyes as he seemed to reassess the situation, recognizing, perhaps for the first time, that this wasn't going to unfold as easily as he'd expected. "We'll be back," Gentry said, breaking the tense silence, his tone still maddeningly pleasant, despite the threat underneath it, "with proper documentation, and enough men to ensure the transfer goes smoothly, should further persuasion prove necessary." They rode off without another word, leaving Clara and Silas standing in the trampled snow, breath fogging in the cold, the threat they'd just faced down, settling into something heavier now that the immediate danger had passed. "You knew," Clara said, once the riders had disappeared over the hill, "about the burial. You said you put the watch in his hand yourself." "I did," Silas said, his voice tight with something between anger and confusion, "which means either I buried the wrong man, or Arthur paid someone to make sure the body was unrecognizable enough that nobody would question it too closely. He murdered someone to fake his death." Silas didn't answer right away, his expression grim as the full weight of the realization settled in. Wouldn't put it past him. Man like that, willing to sell his own wife to a mining camp to protect his interests. Wouldn't blink twice at ending another life to buy himself time. Clara looked down at the knife, still gripped tight in her hand, her knuckles white from the force of her grip. She thought about the woman she'd been stepping off that train months ago. Thin coat, frozen hands, utterly unprepared for a world this harsh. That woman would have frozen at the sight of Arthur, alive, would have collapsed under the weight of his threats. She wasn't that woman anymore. "He'll come back," she said, "with more men." "He will." Silas turned to face her fully, something steady and sure in his gaze, despite the danger closing in around them. "But we've got time to prepare, and you're not facing this alone. Not this time. Not ever so long as I'm standing." Clara nodded, lowering the knife slowly, though she didn't set it aside entirely. Some instincts, once awakened, didn't fully quiet down again. They spent the rest of the day reinforcing the cabin, checking the rifle's ammunition, telling what defenses they could manage against men who would arrive not with words this time, but with force. The threat of Arthur and Gentry hung over everything now, a shadow that had followed Clara clear across the country only to catch up with her here, in the one place she'd finally begun to feel something like home. But as the sun set that evening, painting the snow in shades of orange and violet, Clara found herself standing at the fence line beside Silas. Not afraid exactly, but resolute in a way she hadn't known she was capable of. "I'm not running," she said, more to herself than to him. "Didn't expect you to," Silas said. "Not anymore." The days following Arthur's reappearance passed in careful preparation, but underneath the practical work of reinforcing the cabin and checking supplies. Clara noticed a change in Silas that worried her more than the threat from town. He grew quiet, more withdrawn than usual, his eyes distant during meals, his responses to her questions shorter than they'd been before the storm. She caught him staring at his own burn scar more than once, rubbing his thumb over the raised skin like he was trying to erase something that refused to disappear. She found him in the barn late one evening, 3 days after Arthur's visit, packing a saddlebag with supplies in the dim light of a single lantern. "Where are you going?" she asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer, a cold dread settling into her stomach before he even turned around. "Away," Silas said, not meeting her eyes. "It's better this way." "Better for who?" "For you." He finally looked at her, and the pain behind his expression nearly stole the breath from her lungs. "Arthur knows things about my past, things that could get you caught up in a fight that isn't yours to bear. If I'm gone, he's got no leverage. You keep the ranch. You keep your freedom. And I disappear before I bring the law down on both our heads." "What things?" Clara asked. "What could Arthur possibly know that would make you run in the middle of the night like a coward?" The word landed harder than she intended, and she watched Silas flinch, though he didn't argue against it. "This scar," he said, pulling his sleeve up, exposing the burn that ran jagged from wrist to elbow. "You've wondered about it since the day you first noticed it. I never told you the truth, because the truth isn't something I'm proud of. Tell me now." Silas set the saddlebag down slowly, leaning against the stall door, like the weight of what he was about to say required physical support. "Before I came to work this ranch, I rode with a gang. Train robbers, mostly, working the lines through Nebraska and into the territories. I was young, angry, and I told myself the men I robbed deserved it. Railroad barons who'd stolen more from working folks than we ever took from them. How long? 3 years. Long enough to have a tattoo inked into my arm marking me as one of them. A brand that would have hung me the moment any lawman recognized it. When I finally got out, when I finally understood the life I was living was going to end with a rope around my neck or a bullet in my back, I burned the tattoo off myself. Pressed a hot iron against my own skin rather than risk someone recognizing the mark and turning me in." Clara stared at the scar with new understanding. The jagged, uneven edges suddenly making sense. Not an accident, but a deliberate, agonizing act of self-erasure. "Arthur knows this," Silas continued. "He recognized me the moment he rode up with Gentry, though he didn't say it outright in front of you. If he exposes my past to the law, it doesn't just end badly for me. It puts you in the middle of a manhunt, tangles you up in a scandal that could cost you the ranch, maybe worse. I won't let that happen. Better I disappear now, before it comes to that." "So your solution is to run," Clara said, "and leave me here alone to face Arthur and Gentry by myself." "My solution is to remove the target from your life before it gets you hurt." Clara felt anger rising up fast, sharper than she expected, cutting through the sympathy she'd initially felt at learning the truth of his past. She crossed the barn and grabbed the saddlebag before he could stop her, pulling it out of his hands. "You don't get to decide that for me," she said. "Clara, no, you listen to me." She stood her ground, meeting his eyes directly, despite the tremor of emotion in her voice. "I spent my whole life having decisions made for me. My family decided who I'd marry. Arthur decided I was disposable the moment I became inconvenient. Gentry decided my body was something he could trade a debt for. I am done, Silas, being a decision other people make without asking me first." Silas said nothing, watching her with an expression caught somewhere between guilt and something softer. "I don't need a shield to hide behind," Clara continued, her voice steady now. "Certain. I need the man standing beside me. If you leave tonight, you're not protecting me, you're abandoning me, and dressing it up as sacrifice so it feels noble instead of what it actually is, which is running." The word landed hard, and Silas' jaw tightened, old pride warring with the truth of what she'd said. I've spent years running, he said quietly, from what I did, from who I was. Habit's hard to break. Then break it, Clara said. Stand here. Fight this with me. Whatever Arthur exposes about your past, we face it together. Same as we've faced everything else since that storm. I'm not asking you to protect me by disappearing. I'm asking you to stay and let me stand beside you the same way you've stood beside me. Silas was quiet for a long moment, the lantern light flickering shadows across his face, his old resolve visibly crumbling under the weight of her words. Finally, he set the saddlebag aside completely, the decision settling into his shoulders like something he was choosing this time, rather than something forced upon him. All right, he said. I stay. You stay, Clara repeated, something in her chest easing at the words. But you should know, this isn't going to end simple. Arthur exposes my past. Could be federal marshals riding in behind Gentry's men. Could be a fight bigger than the two of us can handle. Then we prepare for that fight, Clara said. Together, no more midnight rides. No more decisions made in silence without asking me first. Silas nodded, and something passed between them in the quiet of the barn, an understanding deeper than words could fully capture. The recognition of two people choosing, deliberately and with open eyes, to stand together against whatever came next, rather than face it separately. I should have told you about my past sooner, Silas said. Wasn't fair, letting you learn pieces of it through a threat instead of hearing it plain from me. Why didn't you? Because I was ashamed. Because I spent years building a life that had nothing to do with who I used to be. And telling you felt like inviting that old life back in. He looked at his scarred forearm again, though this time without the same self-loathing. But hiding it didn't make it disappear. Just gave Arthur a weapon to use against us. Secrets have a way of doing that, Clara said. Better out in the open, where at least we can face them honestly. They walked back to the cabin together, under a sky scattered thick with stars. The cold sharp, but no longer unwelcome. The kind of cold that felt clean rather than threatening. Clara understood, walking beside him, that the fight ahead would test them both in ways the storm and the wood splitting, and even Gentry's earlier threats, hadn't quite managed. But she also understood something else, something that settled into her with quiet certainty as they crossed the moonlit snow toward the cabin's glowing window. Whatever came next, they would face it as equals, neither one hiding behind the other. Both of them finally, fully, standing on the same ground. They came at dawn, 8 days after Arthur's first visit, riding down from the northern road in a group large enough that Clara counted 6 men before she stopped counting and started preparing instead. Silas had been right about the timing. Late winter had given way to the first thaw, the snow turning soft and heavy, mud showing through in patches where the ground had frozen solid for months. It made for treacherous footing, the kind that could turn an advantage into a liability, depending on who understood the ground better. Get to the root cellar, Silas said, already moving to position himself near the barn. Rifle in hand, stay low, stay quiet, and don't come out until I call for you. I'm not hiding, Clara said, grabbing the second rifle from where it leaned against the doorframe. Not this time. Silas looked at her for a long moment, something torn behind his eyes. The old instinct to protect warring against the newer understanding that protection didn't always mean isolation. Then stay behind the water trough, he said finally. Good cover, clear line toward the road. You see a clean shot, you take it. You don't. You keep your head down. Clara nodded, moving into position as the riders drew closer, close enough now that she could make out individual faces. Gentry rode at the front, his usual composure intact, despite the armed men flanking him. Arthur rode just behind, and behind him. 4 more men Clara didn't recognize, hired guns by the look of their weapons and the careless way they carried themselves. Men used to violence rather than farming or ranching. Thorn. Gentry called out once they'd stopped 100 yards off, still close enough to be heard clearly across the muddy yard. I'd hoped this could be settled through paperwork rather than bullets. But Arthur here has produced documentation proving his claim. And I've got a warrant for your arrest based on information regarding your history with the Cassidy gang. Funny how quick you found a warrant. Silas called back. Given how slow you've been collecting on every other debt in this territory. Justice moves at whatever pace serves it best, Gentry said. And even from this distance, Clara could hear the smile in his voice. Last chance to hand over the woman and surrender peacefully. Not happening, Silas said. The first shot came from one of the hired men, cracking loud across the yard and burying itself in the barn wall a few feet from where Silas crouched. After that, everything dissolved into chaos. Clara had read about gunfights in the dime novels sold back east, stories that made violence sound clean and heroic, men standing tall while bullets found only the guilty. Nothing about the real thing matched those stories. The gunfire came ragged and overlapping. No rhythm to it, just noise and smoke, and the sick reality of men trying to kill each other in the mud. She fired her first shot without fully aiming. More instinct than skill. The recoil jarring her shoulder the same way it had during that first lesson months ago. It missed wide, kicking up mud near one of the rider's horses. But the animal spooked hard, rearing and throwing its rider off balance, buying a few seconds of chaos that worked in their favor. Keep firing, Silas shouted from his position near the barn, working the bolt on his own rifle with practiced efficiency. Each shot measured, deliberate, nothing wasted. Clara reloaded with hands that shook but moved with a speed that surprised her. Muscle memory, built over weeks of practice, finally proving its worth in a moment that mattered. She fired again and again, aiming not to kill, but to disrupt, to force the horses into panic, to buy time and distance rather than chase after some heroic notion of victory. The battle raged through the yard, men shouting, horses screaming, the mud churning up under boots and hooves, until the whole scene looked like something dragged up from a nightmare rather than any romanticized frontier legend. Clara's ears rang from the constant gunfire, the smell of gunpowder, sharp and choking in the cold air. She saw Silas take the bullet before she fully understood what had happened. He'd shifted position, moving to get a better angle on one of the hired guns, pinning them down near the barn, and his boot caught wrong in the mud, throwing his balance off at exactly the wrong moment. The shot caught him high in the shoulder, spinning him sideways before he dropped hard against the barn wall. Silas. Clara's training fell away in an instant, panic surging up fast and overwhelming. But some deeper instinct took over before the fear could fully paralyze her. She fired twice more toward the riders, forcing them back, then scrambled low across the yard toward where Silas had fallen, mud soaking through her knees, bullets still cracking through the air around her. "I'm all right," Silas gritted out, though the blood, already spreading dark across his shoulder, told a different story. "Get back to cover. Not without you." She grabbed him under his good arm, hauling with strength she didn't know she possessed, dragging him behind the water trough as another volley of shots tore through the space they'd just vacated. Silas groaned, pain evident in every line of his face. But he kept his good hand steady on his rifle, still fighting despite the injury. "They're pulling back," Clara said, watching through the gap in the trough as the riders, spooked by the sustained resistance and the loss of 2 horses to panic, began retreating toward the tree line. "Temporary," Silas managed, breathing hard through clenched teeth. "They'll regroup. Come back with a plan instead of just numbers." Clara tore a strip from her sleeve, pressing it hard against the wound in his shoulder, trying to slow the bleeding, despite her hands shaking from adrenaline and fear. "This needs more than a bandage," she said. "It'll hold for now. Help me up." She helped him back toward the cabin, half carrying his weight across the muddy yard, watching the tree line the whole way for any sign the riders might return before they'd made it to safety. Once inside, she worked fast, cleaning the wound as best she could with what supplies they had, remembering fragments of what Abigail had taught her about treating injuries with what the land and their limited stores could provide. "You need a real doctor," Clara said, wrapping the wound tight after cleaning it. This is beyond willow bark and sage. Nearest doctor's 2 days ride in good weather. We don't have 2 days. And the roads are half mud right now besides. Silas leaned back against the wall, pale from blood loss, sweat already beading on his forehead, despite the cold. We fight this our own way, or we don't fight it at all. Clara looked out the window toward the yard, still littered with signs of the battle. Mud churned up dark against the melting snow. Spent shells scattered near the barn. She thought about Gentry's warrant, about Arthur's claim to the land, about the fact that violence alone hadn't settled anything, only bought them a temporary reprieve before the next assault came. There has to be another way, she said, more to herself than to Silas, something beyond guns and bandages. There's Arthur's paperwork, Silas said, his voice weaker now as the adrenaline that had carried him through the fight began to fade. He filed a claim on this land, filed it under some name or another. If there's a flaw in that filing, a technicality, that might do more damage than any bullet. Clara turned the idea over in her mind. Remembering the ledgers she'd seen stacked in Silas's small office, off the back room, records he'd kept meticulously since taking over as foreman years ago. "Show me where you keep the land records," she said, "all of them. Everything Arthur ever filed. Everything you've got on this ranch's history." Silas managed to faint. Pain smiled despite the blood loss. Bottom drawer, the desk in the back room. Locked, but the keys under the inkwell. Clara helped him settle onto the bed, checking the bandage once more before moving toward the back room. Determination replacing the fear that had gripped her during the fight. If bullets and violence weren't going to win this war, then she would find another weapon, one buried in paperwork and legal technicalities, one that might prove far more powerful than any rifle in the end. Outside, the mud continued to settle after the chaos of battle, and somewhere beyond the tree line, Gentry and Arthur regrouped, planning their next move. But inside the cabin, Clara pulled the ledgers from their locked drawer and began to read, searching for the flaw that would finally end this fight for good. The fever set in on the second day after the shootout, and Clara watched with growing dread as Silas's condition worsened despite her best efforts to keep the wound clean. His skin burned hot to the touch, sweat soaking through the blankets no matter how often she changed them, and his words came slurred and disconnected when he spoke at all. "Infection," she said aloud, mostly to herself, remembering fragments of what Abigail had taught her about wounds gone bad. "I need Abigail. I need real medicine." But writing for Abigail meant leaving Silas alone and vulnerable, and staying meant watching him grow weaker without the supplies needed to properly treat the infection spreading beneath the bandage. She made her choice fast, packing what she needed, checking the rifle one final time, and pressing a cool cloth against Silas's forehead before she left. "I'll be back," she told him, though she wasn't certain he could hear her through the fever's grip. "Hold on, just hold on until I get back." The ride to Abigail's cabin took longer than she wanted, the road still treacherous with mud and melting snow. But she pushed the horse harder than she'd ever pushed an animal before, urgency driving away any hesitation she might have felt in easier circumstances. Abigail took one look at her face when she arrived, and immediately began gathering supplies without asking for explanation first. "Infection?" Abigail asked, already packing herbs and clean linens into a bag. "Gunshot wound, high fever, delirious by the time I left." "How long ago was he shot?" 2 days. Abigail's expression tightened, understanding the severity without needing further explanation. "We need to move fast. Infections like this can turn deadly within hours once the fever climbs high enough." They rode back together, Abigail's medical knowledge a comfort against the rising panic Clara had been fighting since Silas's fever first spiked. But even as they rode, Clara's mind turned toward the ledgers she'd left half-read on the desk back at the cabin. The flaw she'd suspected, but hadn't yet confirmed in Arthur's land claim. Back at the ranch, Abigail worked quickly, cleaning the wound properly this time, applying poultices that smelled sharp and medicinal, forcing willow bark tea between Silas's cracked lips despite his semi-conscious state. "The infection's bad," Abigail said quietly. "Once she'd done what she could. I've cleaned it as best I can. But he needs rest now, and time, and whatever strength his body's got left to fight it off. Beyond that, it's out of our hands." Clara sat beside the bed through the night, watching Silas's chest rise and fall, listening to his labored breathing, praying to whatever God might be listening that his body would find the strength to survive. But even in her vigil, her mind kept circling back to the ledgers, to the fragments of information she'd gathered before the fever took hold of her full attention. Arthur had filed his original land claim under the name Arthur Vance. That much matched the official records Silas kept, but buried deeper in the paperwork. Clara had found something curious, a secondary filing made years earlier, under a different name entirely, a name that matched Arthur's description but claimed a different identity altogether. If Arthur had filed his original homestead claim under an alias, one used to escape debts, or a criminal past predating even his marriage to Clara, that would render the entire claim void under federal land grant regulations. Void claims meant void ownership, which meant Arthur had no legal right to the ranch at all, regardless of whether he was alive or dead. But proving it required more than suspicion. It required documentation, cross-reference records, proof solid enough to stand up against whatever lawyers Gentry might produce to argue otherwise. As dawn broke and Silas's fever finally began to break alongside it, his breathing easing into something more natural, Clara made her decision. "I need to ride into town," she told Abigail, who had stayed through the night to monitor Silas's condition, "to the county clerk's office. There's something in these records that could end this whole fight. But I need official documentation to prove it. The roads are still bad," Abigail said, "and Gentry's men could be watching for exactly this kind of move. I don't have a choice. Silas can't fight this from a sickbed, and I'm not waiting for Arthur and Gentry to regroup and finish what they started." Abigail studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll stay with Silas. You do what needs doing." The ride into town took most of the day, the mountain passes treacherous with mud and half-melted snow. Clara's hands growing numb from cold and exhaustion by the time she finally reached the outskirts of town. She'd pushed through fatigue that would have stopped her months ago, back when she'd first stepped off that train. Thin coat and unfamiliar hands, utterly unprepared for a world this demanding. She wasn't that woman anymore. The county clerk's office sat near the center of town, a modest building that held within its walls the power to settle disputes that guns and threats never could. Clara walked in with mud caked up her skirt, hands raw and frostbitten from the ride, and slammed the ledgers she'd brought down onto the clerk's desk with a force that startled the elderly man working there. "I need to file a claim dispute," she said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion, "against a fraudulent land filing made by a man named Arthur Vance, who I have reason to believe originally filed under a different alias." The clerk, a thin man with spectacles perched low on his nose, examined the documents she'd brought with growing interest. "This is quite thorough, Mrs. Vance. Where did you obtain these records?" "From the ranch's own filing history. Records kept by the foreman for the past 3 years." Clara pulled a second document from her bag, one she'd found buried deeper in the files. A description matching Arthur's physical characteristics filed under the name Arthur Voss 3 years prior in a neighboring county. "This description matches my husband exactly. Same scar above the left eyebrow, same height and build. Filed under a different name entirely. Likely to escape debts he owed before ever coming to this territory." The clerk studied the documents carefully, cross-referencing dates and descriptions, with a meticulousness that gave Clara hope for the first time in days. "If this proves accurate, and I'll need to verify it through proper channels, this would indeed void the original homestead claim. Federal regulations are quite clear that fraudulent identity in a land filing constitutes grounds for immediate forfeiture." "How long would verification take?" "Days, typically. Perhaps longer given the distances involved." Clara felt something cold settle into her stomach. Days meant more time for Arthur and Gentry to regroup. More time for Silas to remain vulnerable while recovering from his wound. More time for the fight to drag on when every instinct in her screamed for resolution now. "I don't have days," she said. "I have a man back at that ranch, fighting an infection that nearly killed him defending it, and I have a legal right, as a woman who has independently worked and improved this land, to claim it under the Homestead Homes Act, regardless of Arthur's fraudulent filing." The clerk looked up at her, something shifting in his expression at the conviction in her voice. The Homestead Act does allow single women to file independent claims, provided they can demonstrate continuous residence and improvement of the land in question. I've lived and worked that ranch for months. I've split the wood, tended the animals, fought off armed men trying to take it by force. If Arthur's claim is fraudulent, then that land has effectively sat under improvement by myself and the ranch's foreman, independent of any legitimate ownership by Arthur Vance at all. The clerk was quiet for a long moment, weighing the legal implications of what she was proposing. "It's an unusual argument, Mrs. Vance, but not without merit. I could process an emergency filing on your behalf, citing the fraudulent original claim as grounds for immediate reassignment. It wouldn't be entirely conventional, but given the documentation you've provided, I believe it could be justified." "Do it," Clara said. "Today now." The clerk nodded, pulling out the necessary paperwork, and Clara spent the next several hours working through the filing process, answering questions, providing testimony about her time on the ranch, using the very legal system that had once threatened to hand her over to Gentry as a debt payment to now secure her independence entirely. By the time she rode out of town that evening, exhausted but triumphant, she carried with her official documentation stripping Arthur of any legal claim to the ranch and establishing Clara's own homestead rights in its place. It wasn't a victory won through violence or force. It was a victory won through patience, through intellect, through the careful application of laws that had been built by men but could, when wielded correctly, serve a woman's interests just as effectively. She returned to find Silas's fever fully broken, color returning to his face. Abigail, sitting beside him with a satisfied expression that suggested the worst had finally passed. "You look like you rode through hell and back," Silas said weakly, but with a faint smile that told her he was truly on the mend. "Something like that," Clara said, pulling the documentation from her bag and setting it on the table beside the bed. "Arthur's claim on this land was fraudulent from the start. I've filed for independent homestead rights. Legally, this ranch belongs to no one but me now." Silas studied the papers, understanding dawning slowly across his tired features. "You did this, while I was laid up useless with fever. You weren't useless. You bought us the time I needed by surviving." Clara sat down beside the bed, exhaustion finally catching up with her now that the adrenaline had faded. "This isn't over yet. Arthur and Gentry will fight this, contest the filing, try every trick they know. But we've got the law on our side now, solid and undeniable, and that's a weapon they can't outshoot or out-threaten." Silas reached for her hand, his grip weak but sure, and Clara let him hold it, understanding that this small gesture carried the same weight as everything else they'd built together since that first frozen morning at the train station. "We'll finish this together," he said, "however it plays out." "Together," Clara agreed. Outside, the last of the winter snow continued its slow retreat, giving way to the muddy, uncertain beginnings of spring. A season of new growth, arriving even as the fight for their future remained unresolved. But for the first time since Arthur's ghost had ridden back into her life, Clara felt something like confidence settling into her chest, a certainty that whatever came next, she now had the tools, the knowledge, and the partnership to face it head-on. The legal battle that followed took 6 weeks to fully resolve. Weeks filled with correspondence between the county clerk's office and federal land authorities. Weeks of Gentry attempting every angle he could find to salvage his hold over the debt and the ranch. Weeks of Arthur's increasingly desperate attempts to prove his original claim legitimate despite the damning evidence of his fraudulent filing under a false identity. But the law, once set into motion, proved harder to fight than either man had anticipated. Federal investigators arrived in early April, drawn by the fraud complaint Clara had filed, and their investigation uncovered far more than the simple land dispute at the heart of the ranch's ownership. Arthur, it turned out, had left a trail of debts and fraudulent dealings stretching back years, multiple identities used to escape creditors, and, in at least one confirmed case, to fake his own death in order to avoid a debt owed to a business partner in Nebraska, who'd since died searching for the money Arthur owed him. The fire that had supposedly killed Arthur, investigators determined, had indeed claimed a real victim, a drifter Arthur had paid to occupy the barn that night, promising him shelter and work, never disclosing the true danger of the arrangement. It was, in the end, a murder charge that finally sealed Arthur's fate, layered on top of the fraud and debt evasion that had already destroyed his credibility. Gentry's involvement unraveled alongside Arthur's. The marshal's attempts to profit from Clara's vulnerability, documented clearly enough in witness testimony, and Silas's own accounts of the threats made in that drafty kitchen months before. By the time the federal investigation concluded, Gentry had been stripped of his badge, facing his own charges for corruption and abuse of his position, a fall from power that mirrored the fall Clara herself had feared during those early days of her arrival in the territory. Silas's own past came up during the investigation. The tattoo scar and his history with the Cassidy gang surfacing in the records, despite his attempts to leave that life fully behind. But the federal marshal assigned to the case, reviewing the full context of Silas's actions over the past 3 years, his work turning the ranch into a legitimate operation, his defense of Clara against both Arthur and Gentry's threats, ultimately decided against pursuing charges for crimes committed years earlier under circumstances that no longer matched the man he'd since become. Statute of limitations mostly covers it anyway, the marshal told them during his final visit to the ranch. And frankly, Mr. Thorne, a man who spends 3 years building something honest out of a life that was anything but doesn't strike me as someone the courts need to waste resources chasing down for old sins he's clearly already paid for. By the time the last of the legal proceedings concluded, spring had fully arrived, the snow gone entirely from all but the highest mountain peaks, the creek running high and fast with the last of the winter melt, the fields around the ranch beginning to show the first green signs of new growth pushing up through soil that had been frozen solid for months. Silas's shoulder had healed, though not completely. The bullet had damaged something deep in the joint that no amount of rest or medicine could fully restore, leaving him with a permanent stiffness that slowed his draw and limited the full range of motion he'd once had. Clara found him at the fence line on a warm afternoon in late April, working the joint slowly, testing its limits with an expression she recognized as something between frustration and quiet acceptance. "It's not coming back," he said without turning to look at her, sensing her approach the way he always seemed to. "Full strength, I mean. Doctor in town confirmed it last week. I'll never draw fast again. Not like I used to." "Does that matter to you?" Clara asked, coming to stand beside him at the fence. Used to think it would matter more than anything. He flexed the shoulder again, wincing slightly at the stiffness. "That old life. The gang, the gun work. It defined me for a long time. Even after I left it behind, some part of me held on to the idea that I was still fast, still dangerous, still capable of that life if circumstances ever demanded it again. And now, Silas was quiet for a long moment, watching the fields spread out before them, green, pushing up through brown earth, cattle grazing peacefully, where months before the ground had been frozen and hostile. "Now I think maybe I'm supposed to be done with that life entirely," he said finally. "This shoulder. It's like the land finally closing that door for good, making sure I can't go back, even if some old habit tried to pull me toward it." "You don't need to be fast with a gun," Clara said. "You never did. Not really. What you needed to be was steady, reliable. Someone who stood his ground even when standing still made him a target. That easy to forgive a man for the life he used to live. Clara considered the question seriously, thinking about her own past, the scars on her wrists that had faded but never fully disappeared, the years of learning to survive circumstances that had tried repeatedly to break her. I'm not in the business of forgiving pasts people have already worked hard to leave behind, she said. I'm in the business of recognizing who a person chooses to be now, in the present, when it actually matters. Silas turned to look at her then, something vulnerable crossing his features. The same vulnerability she'd first glimpsed the night of the blizzard when he'd offered his warmth without demanding anything in return. I don't feel worthy of what you're offering, he said quietly. This ranch is yours now, legally and rightfully. You built this future through your own strength, your own intelligence. I'm just a broken-down former outlaw with a bad shoulder and a past that nearly got you killed twice over. Clara reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the deed to the ranch, the official document that had arrived just days before, finalizing her ownership after the long legal battle. She unfolded it carefully, and before Silas could fully process what she was doing, she tore it cleanly down the middle, dividing it into two equal halves. Clara, what? I'm not interested in owning this ranch alone, she said, pressing one half of the torn deed into his good hand, closing his fingers around it deliberately. I never was. Every hard thing that's happened since I stepped off that train. You've stood beside me through it. The wood splitting, the shooting lessons, the blizzard, the gunfight, all of it. This ranch isn't mine because I fought for it alone. It's ours because we fought for it together. Silas looked down at the torn deed in his hand, then back up at her, something breaking open behind his eyes that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with a hope he'd clearly been afraid to fully allow himself. This isn't charity, Clara continued, before he could argue. This isn't pity for a broken shoulder or a hard past. This is partnership, equal, honest, built on everything we've survived together, rather than anything either of us owes the other. I don't have much to offer, Silas said, his voice rough. Debt still owed on repairs, a shoulder that'll never work right again, a past that federal marshals only let slide because of statute of limitations. You've got a lifetime of knowing how to survive hard land, Clara said. You've got patience I didn't know men were capable of until I met you. You've got a way of respecting boundaries that taught me, for the first time in my life, that closeness didn't have to mean danger. She stepped closer, close enough now that the space between them had nearly disappeared entirely. That's worth more than any deed, Silas. That's worth building an entire future around. Silas set the torn half of the deed carefully into his coat pocket, then reached up, slow and deliberate, to touch her face, the same careful restraint he'd shown from the very first day. Still present even now, still respectful of the boundary between offering and demanding. Sleep beside me, he said softly, echoing words spoken months before in a dying cabin during a storm that had nearly killed them both. Not just for survival this time, Clara smiled, something warm and certain settling into her chest. Nothing like the fear that had once accompanied any man's closeness, only the quiet confidence of choosing, freely and completely, to build a life alongside someone who had earned that choice through months of proving, patiently, that he would never take what wasn't offered. Every night, she said, for as long as you'll have me. They stood together at the fence line as the afternoon sun warmed, the thawing earth around them, the howling winds of winter long since faded into memory, replaced now by the gentle sound of the creek running full and steady toward the valley below. Ahead of them lay a mountain of work, debts still to settle, a roof still needing full repair, fields to plant and cattle to tend through whatever challenges the coming seasons would bring. But they faced it together now, equal partners standing on ground they'd fought hard to claim, hands finally, fully joined. A quiet testament to everything survival could build when two people chose partnership over dominance, respect over demand, and patience over the kind of rushed closeness that had defined so much of the harm in both their pasts. The creek kept running, the fields kept greening, and somewhere beneath the melting snow on the highest peaks, spring continued its slow, steady work of turning what winter had frozen solid back into something alive, something growing, something finally, fully free. What Clara Hayes's story leaves behind is more than the memory of a lonely ranch, a cruel winter, or a woman fighting for a piece of land in the Wyoming Territory. It leaves us with a quiet but powerful truth. Freedom is not always won in one grand moment. Sometimes, freedom is built slowly, one painful choice at a time. Clara did not arrive in the West as a fearless woman. She arrived cold, abandoned, confused, and nearly broken by a life that had taught her to obey, endure, and survive in silence. She came looking for a husband and found a grave. She came looking for safety and found debt, danger, and men who believed her future could be bought, traded, or controlled. But the beauty of her journey is that she did not become strong because life was kind to her. She became strong because life gave her every reason to collapse, and she chose to stand anyway. This story reminds us that a person's worth can never be measured by what others try to take from them. Marshall Gentry saw Clara as a debt to be collected. Arthur saw her as property to be moved, sold, or used when convenient. But Silas saw something different. He saw a human being with the right to choose. And that difference matters. One of the deepest lessons in this story is that real love does not demand ownership. Real love does not force, trap, threaten, or decide for someone else. Real love leaves room. It respects boundaries. It waits. It protects without controlling. Silas's strength was not only in the way he held a rifle or faced danger. His true strength was in the way he refused to take what was not freely given. In a world where too many men confused power with possession, Silas showed that the strongest man is often the one who knows how to be gentle. Clara's growth also teaches us that healing is not the same as forgetting. She carried fear in her body long after the danger had passed. A loud sound, a sudden touch, a night of forced closeness. Each one could bring back memories she wished were buried forever. But the story never treats that fear as weakness. Instead, it shows that trauma is something the body remembers, and courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is breathing through it. Courage is picking up the rifle again, after your hands have shaken. Courage is saying, I am not going anywhere with you, even when the person threatening you once had power over your life. Clara did not become brave because she stopped being afraid. She became brave because she stopped letting fear make every decision for her. Another important value in this story is the power of knowledge. The final victory was not won only with bullets or fists. It was won with records, law, patience, and a woman who learned to think for herself. Clara discovered that paperwork could become a weapon when placed in the hands of someone who understood the truth. That is a powerful lesson for every audience. Strength is not always loud. Sometimes strength is reading the fine print. Sometimes it is asking questions. Sometimes it is learning the rules of a system that once seemed built against you, then using those rules to protect your own future. Clara's intelligence saved the ranch as much as Silas's courage did. Together they proved that survival requires both heart and wisdom. Silas's journey carries its own lesson. He was a man with a past he could not erase. He had made mistakes. He had run from shame. He had tried to burn the mark of his old life from his skin, but the past still followed him. Yet, the story does not say a person is forever trapped by who they used to be. It says redemption is possible, but only when a person stops hiding and starts choosing differently. Silas did not become worthy because he was perfect. He became worthy because, when the moment came, he stayed. He stood beside Clara instead of running. He told the truth. He accepted the cost. and he chose an honest life, not because it was easy, but because it was right. In the end, the ranch becomes more than land. It becomes a symbol of everything Clara and Silas earned together: dignity, trust, equality, and a future built on respect instead of fear. When Clara tears the deed in half and gives part of it to Silas, she is not giving away her freedom. She is proving she finally owns it. Only a free person can choose partnership without losing herself. Only a healed heart can say, "I want to stand beside you," not because it has no other choice, but because it chooses love with open eyes. And that is the meaning of this story. No winter lasts forever. No cruel man gets to define the end of someone else's life. No past mistake, no old wound, and no season of suffering has the final word if a person keeps walking toward the light. Clara's journey tells us that even after betrayal, fear, and loss, a human being can still rise. A broken life can still become a beautiful one. And sometimes, the place where you thought you had been abandoned becomes the very ground where you finally learn how to be free. All elements within this narrative are fictional and crafted for storytelling purposes. The author bears no intention of referencing real people, cultures, or events in a literal sense. Readers are encouraged to engage with the work as a piece of creative expression rather than documented reality.